The cold in the northern forests wasn't just temperature, it was a presence. It crept through wool, through bone, and into memory. Jonas Hale moved silently through the snow, his rifle slung over one shoulder, a canvas sack of supplies on the other. The wind rolled across the trees in slow sighs, rattling branches crusted with frost. His breath fogged in short bursts. He didn't speak. He hadn't spoken to another soul in over 6 months. His traps were set along a half-frozen tributary that fed into what used to be Silverbone Lake. Used to be, before the old floodplain froze so solid the maps had to be redrawn. Now it was just ice and silence stretching forever. Jonas had walked these woods for over 30 years, first as a guide, then a hunter, and now something between the two. After his wife and daughter died in a snowmobile accident 3 winters ago, the land became both punishment and refuge. Here, pain didn't echo. It just sat with you in the cold. He was checking the 3rd trap of the day, empty. As usual, when he noticed them. Tracks. Fresh. He crouched. They weren't wolf prints. Not big enough. Not shaped right. And definitely not deer. Too round. Too heavy in the front. He leaned in, brow furrowing. Whatever had made them had weight. But not size. A cub. Maybe. But what kind? Curiosity. Dulled by grief for so long. Stirred for the first time in ages. He followed the tracks north. Boots crunching over a thin layer of windblown snow. They led across a frozen inlet. Then onto the solid sheet of the lake itself. Jonas hesitated. Ice could be treacherous even in the deep freeze, but the prints were sharp. Recent. The sun had barely risen, and nothing had had time to melt. He took a cautious step onto the ice. Then another. The surface groaned faintly beneath him. He tightened his jaw, shifted his weight lower, and kept going. The tracks ended near the center of the lake. There, surrounded by a fractured ring of splintered ice, was a hole. Something had fallen through. He saw movement. Jonas dropped to his knees. A small, golden body struggled in the freezing water, paws slapping at the edge of the broken ice. The creature was soaked, trembling violently, barely keeping its head above the slush. Its eyes, wide, feral, terrified, locked onto him. A mountain lion. No, a cub. Thin, maybe 6 months old, lean muscle stretched over bone. Alone, dying. Jonas didn't think. He dropped his pack and rifle, fell flat against the ice, and began crawling forward. The lake groaned louder now beneath his weight. Thin cracks spider-webbed beneath him. But he kept going. The cub flailed again, slipping. It couldn't get a grip. Its claws scraped the ice with a sound that pierced the air. Easy, Jonas muttered, mostly to himself. Don't fight it. He reached the edge. His gloves were soaked instantly as he plunged his arms into the freezing water. The shock tore through his limbs. But he gritted his teeth. The cub let out a weak hiss. Then coughed. Jonas grabbed it under the front legs and heaved. It wasn't heavy, but it was all muscle and panic. The ice around them cracked again, and for a moment Jonas thought they were both going in. Then, miraculously, the cub slid free. It collapsed onto the ice beside him, coughing water, shivering so violently its teeth chattered audibly. Jonas didn't wait. He wrapped it in his parka, scooped it into his chest, and began crawling backward inch by inch until his boots hit solid snow. He stood, breath ragged, heart hammering. The cub made no attempt to run. It was too weak. It simply trembled in his arms, wrapped in heavy canvas, blinking up at him with unblinking gold eyes. Jonas stared back. He didn't understand why he had done it, why he'd risked his life, why his body had moved before his mind. But something in that moment, on the frozen lake, beneath the cloud-choked sky, broke the silence inside him. He turned, holding the cub against his chest, and walked back toward the cabin. That night, by the fire, Jonas sat with a cup of black coffee in his hand, watching the cub sleep in a pile of wool blankets. Its breathing was shallow but steady. It hadn't eaten yet, but it was alive. Jonas leaned back, the warmth from the fire washing over his numb fingers. Snow tapped gently at the cabin windows, soft as breath. For the first time in years, the silence felt less like a wait, and more like a beginning. The cabin groaned in the wind like an old ship, but inside it was warm and flickering with firelight. Jonas moved slowly, deliberately, as he always did, habits honed by years alone, and made sharper by the presence of the creature curled in the corner. The mountain lion cub lay in a heap of towels near the wood stove, eyes half-lidded, flank rising and falling with each labored breath. Its fur, once matted with ice and sludge, had dried into soft golden clumps. A few shallow scratches lined its limbs, likely from the jagged edges of the broken lake ice. Jonas had cleaned them with boiled water and a pinch of iodine. The cub hadn't protested, just lay still, shivering, too exhausted to fight. Jonas didn't say much. Words weren't his currency anymore. He preferred action, splitting wood, checking traps, boiling tea that he never quite drank. But as he watched the cub doze, something restless stirred behind his ribs. It had been years since he'd tended to another living being. When he reached for a wool blanket and gently draped it over the cub, its ears flicked slightly, but it didn't move. "You'll live," he muttered. The cub's tail twitched. Jonas sat back in his worn armchair, hand resting on the rifle beside him, not out of threat, just habit. He kept the fire steady and the room quiet. By morning, the cub had moved. Not far, just a slow crawl closer to the heat, its head resting now on its paws. Jonas noticed its eyes were clearer, watching him again, calm, not afraid, assessing. That was when Jonas began to notice the strangeness. The cub wasn't wild, not in the way wild animals usually are. There was no panic in its movements, no flinch when he approached. Its breathing stayed steady, its body language careful but not defensive. Even the way it scanned the room, slow, methodical, felt more like thought than instinct. He slid a shallow metal bowl of water across the floor. The cub didn't lunge for it. It walked to the bowl and lapped. Slow and clean, no splashing, no snarling. Jonas raised an eyebrow. "You're not normal," he said, half to himself. The cub flicked its eyes toward him. No fear, just that same eerie calm. For 2 days, Jonas let it recover. He didn't name it at first. Naming meant admitting it might stay. But the more he watched, the harder it was to ignore the way the cub followed him with its eyes. Even when pretending to sleep, how it began to inch closer to his chair in the evenings, settling at a cautious distance, but closer all the same. And on the third night, when Jonas sat by the fire and murmured, "Feels like I've got a shadow," the cub padded over, without hesitation, and curled at his feet. He stared at it for a long time. "You need a name," he said quietly. Can't keep calling you it. He thought of the golden coat. The way it caught the firelight like embers in motion. How it had fallen from the sky into his life. A living warmth in the midst of a long, frozen winter. Sol, he said aloud. Like the sun. The cub looked up at the word. Jonas nodded once. Sol. Then. Days passed. Sol grew stronger. He limped slightly from a back paw. Likely bruised or strained in the fall. But it didn't stop him from exploring. Jonas let him roam the single-room cabin. He never jumped onto counters. Never clawed furniture. He was cautious, but oddly respectful of space. Even boundaries. When Jonas pointed and said, "No," the first time Sol nosed toward the woodpile. The cub froze, and backed off. That's when Jonas knew for sure. Someone raised you. Sol blinked, as if confirming it. You weren't born out here. Not wild. Not really. It didn't make sense. Mountain lions weren't pets. Not legally. Not ethically. And certainly not ones that behaved like this. If someone had tried to domesticate him, they'd failed, or worse. Maybe Sol had escaped. Maybe he'd been released. Jonas tried to dismiss it. But his instincts, honed from decades of tracking animals and reading the land, told him this wasn't just an orphan. Sol was something else. Something trained. But for what? That question haunted Jonas more than he liked to admit. Still, he didn't push the mystery. Not yet. Instead, he focused on the present. On feeding Sol soft scraps of cooked fish and game. On boiling snow for drinking water. On watching him regain his strength. One evening, as snow whispered down in faint spirals outside the frosted window, Jonas sat carving a strip of pine by lamplight. Sol lay by the door, watching the blade rise and fall. "You're not afraid of the knife?" Jonas observed. Sol blinked slowly. Jonas stared back. "You're not afraid of me either." The fire crackled. Jonas set the knife down. "I used to talk to my daughter like this," he said quietly, "back before the ice took her. Just talked, even if she didn't answer." Sol tilted his head. Jonas smiled faintly. Not wide, just enough to feel it in his chest. "You're not her. I know that. But it's something. Just having someone listen." Sol shifted closer and rested his head on Jonas's boot. For the first time in years, Jonas didn't move away. The wilderness beyond the cabin remained unchanged, cold, vast, unforgiving. But inside, something had shifted. A man who had closed himself off now opened the door each morning. Not just to check traps, but to see if Sol wanted to follow. The silence was still there, but it no longer hurt. It held room now, for breath, for warmth, for a stranger in fur who was becoming, piece by piece, not so much a mystery, but a companion. Jonas had lived long enough in the northern wilds to know when something was wrong. It began with the crows. 3 mornings in a row. They circled low over the tree line, cawing sharply, not at carcasses, but at movement. The kind of movement that didn't belong. The kind that didn't make noise. Left no obvious scent, and vanished before you could find its source. Sol noticed it too. The young lion, now nearly fully recovered, would pause mid-meal, ears pricked, head turning toward the woods. His golden eyes sharpened, tracking things that Jonas couldn't see, but felt. Then came the prints. Jonas found them near the southern perimeter of his trap line, boot treads. Deep, deliberate, made within the past 6 hours. Not snowmobile, No local trapper would hike this far in heavy gear. These weren't the boots of a hunter or a hiker. They were uniform, military-grade soles. Jonas knelt beside them, pressing a gloved hand into the print. Wide spacing between steps. Heavy. Probably someone carrying a pack or armed. 2 sets. Side by side. He followed them for 100 meters before they vanished, too cleanly. Too perfectly. Erased. Jonas muttered, standing slowly. His breath curled into the morning air. Someone was watching. Back at the cabin, Jonas lit the wood stove and moved with practiced calm. But inside his thoughts raced. He hadn't told anyone about Sol. Hell, no one even knew he was still alive. Really, he hadn't been into town in almost a year. Didn't use the radio. Paid cash for everything, when he had to. So how did someone find them? Unless. He turned slowly to look at Sol, who lay curled by the hearth, licking at one paw, seemingly relaxed. "Come here, boy," Jonas said, trying to keep his voice steady. Sol looked up, then rose and padded over, tail low and curious. Jonas knelt and ran his hands through the thick fur at the lion's neck. Sol stiffened briefly but didn't pull away. Then, beneath the muscle, behind the curve of the left jaw, Jonas felt it. A lump. Hard. Round. Metal. He swore under his breath. Sol growled softly, sensing the change. "It's not you," Jonas muttered. "Not your fault." He went to the drawer, pulled out a pair of fine forceps and an old skinning knife. His hands worked carefully. Sol sat perfectly still, too still. Like he understood what was happening. With a slow, careful cut and a bit of pressure, the object came free. Jonas held it to the light. A chip. Not veterinary. Sleek. Black casing. Sealed. He cracked it open over the workbench and found a microcircuit with a tiny power cell still pulsing faintly. Active. Jonas cursed again. Whoever had tagged Sol had been tracking him since before he hit the ice. And they were close. He wrapped the device in foil and crushed it beneath his boot. Then swept the shards into the stove. Sparks hissed and spat into the flames. Sol watched every motion. "You were never just a wild thing. Were you?" Jonas said quietly. "You belong to someone. Something." He looked at the lion, now sitting calmly in the center of the cabin. "I think you ran." That night, Jonas couldn't sleep. He sat at the table long after Sol had curled up in the corner. Maps spread out before him. His topographic charts showed the nearby ridges, lakes, and abandoned forestry roads. If someone wanted to set up a research site, private, isolated, off-grid, it would be northeast. Beyond Black Timber Lake. There'd been rumors years ago. A facility. Some kind of wildlife monitoring station. Nothing official. Hunters avoided the place. Trappers said game disappeared there. And now Sol had shown up half dead with a tracking chip in his neck. It fit too well. The next morning, Jonas packed. Not to run, but to learn. He needed to know who had made Sol the way he was. What they'd done to him. And why they were so determined to get him back. He left Sol inside, closing the cabin door gently behind him. But Sol wouldn't stay. An hour into the hike, the lion appeared at his side, moving silently through the trees. Ears alert, tail low. Jonas stopped, staring down at him. "I'm not bringing you to them," he said. Sol didn't turn back. He simply sat, waiting. Jonas sighed. "All right, let's go together, then." By late afternoon, They reached a ridge overlooking a clearing Jonas hadn't seen in years. A wide building lay below, half camouflaged by the trees. Squat, concrete, featureless. Antennas poked through the snow above its roof. A single van sat outside. Black, unmarked. Jonas raised his binoculars. Two men in heavy coats emerged from the trees. One holding a tablet, the other scanning with a thermal scope. They weren't researchers. They were retrieval. Sol stood beside him, body tense, eyes focused, not on the building, but on the men. He remembered. Jonas lowered the binoculars. "We don't go closer," he said. "Not yet." They retreated into the woods. As they made camp under a dense canopy, Jonas stared at the embers of their fire and thought about the name he'd given the lion, Sol. The sun. But maybe it was more than warmth. Maybe it was light, shining on something dark. Something someone wanted to keep buried. The snow started falling just before dusk, quiet. Dry flakes that whispered against the windows of the cabin. Jonas Hale sat at the edge of his bed, sharpening a knife he hadn't used in years. Not since his wife and daughter were alive. Sol lay by the hearth, tail curled, eyes half shut but not asleep. The lion's ears twitched every time Jonas breathed too loudly. It had been days since they spotted the facility. Jonas knew they wouldn't wait much longer. They were tracking, calculating, waiting for the right conditions. And then, the night came. At first it was just a hum, barely audible. But Sol stood at once, low to the ground, eyes trained toward the window. Jonas paused. "What is it?" Then he heard it too. Not wind. A low, electronic whir. Artificial. Approaching. Jonas snatched the lantern and doused the flame, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of moonlit snow through the frosted window panes. Sol pressed against the door. Body still, tail stiff. Then, light. A thin cone of blue-white swept across the clearing. A drone. Jonas moved fast. He grabbed the emergency pack, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and opened the back door. "Go," he hissed. Sol darted out silently into the snow. Behind them, movement. The crunch of boots. Shadows with rifles moved across the white, converging on the front of the cabin. They didn't knock. They kicked in the door. But Jonas and Sol were already gone, swallowed by the trees. They ran in silence. Jonas's breath steamed in the frozen air. Sol glided ahead, occasionally glancing back to make sure Jonas was close. The snow thickened, turning from dust to curtain. It helped. It cloaked them, muffled their passage, distorted heat signatures. Jonas ducked behind a wind-blown pine and waited. Above, a drone pulsed by, light scanning the snow. He knew these woods better than anyone. He didn't need maps to move. They curved west, then north, doubling back into an old ravine, low enough to confuse thermal scans. Jonas laid a false trail of boot prints toward an open slope, then followed Sol down into the ditch, covering their tracks with a pine bough as he moved. It was like teaching his daughter to sneak through the woods again. But now, it was a lion at his side. They moved for hours. No words. Just instinct, rhythm, partnership. Somewhere before dawn, the wind picked up. Jonas slowed, lungs aching, knees burning. Sol paused ahead, ears back, tail sweeping anxiously. "I'm fine," Jonas rasped. "Just need a minute." They pushed on toward the frozen inlet, one of the narrower branches of Silverbone Lake. Jonas knew it well, knew it froze thick. But now, with the recent snow insulating the surface, it was impossible to tell which areas were safe. He scanned for signs of slush or cracks. Too late. The snow gave way beneath his right foot. And suddenly his leg plunged through the ice. A jolt of freezing water shot up his thigh. Damn! The crack widened. Then the ice broke entirely. Jonas crashed through the lake's surface with a splash that tore the breath from his chest. The cold hit like a fist. He fought upward, trying to grip the ice. But his gloves slid uselessly on the wet surface. Then, out of the dark, Sol appeared. The lion lunged toward the edge. Claws splayed, and without hesitation clamped his jaws gently around Jonas's coat collar. The weight shifted. With a mighty pull, Jonas was yanked halfway out of the water. He gasped, grunted, grabbed at the lion's shoulders, pushing with what little strength he had. Sol growled with effort, bracing, digging in. Together, inch by inch, they got him out. Jonas collapsed onto the snow, coughing violently, drenched and shivering. Sol stood over him, tail low, body pressed close for warmth. Jonas reached out, hand shaking, and touched the lion's neck. "Good boy," he muttered through chattering teeth. Sol lay beside him, his heavy breath forming clouds in the dark air. They didn't move for a long time. But something shifted. Not just survival now, something more. By mid-morning, they reached a small cave Jonas had used years ago for overnight hunts. Hidden in a hillside, dry, windproof, Jonas stripped off the soaked clothes and huddled in a sleeping bag. Teeth still chattering, while Sol lay pressed against him. He didn't question it anymore. The lion wasn't just a companion. He was family. Later, Jonas boiled snow over a tiny alcohol stove, forcing warmth back into his limbs. Sol stood guard outside the cave, motionless in the snow, watching the ridgeline. "I don't know what they did to you," Jonas said softly. "What kind of tests? What kind of place you came from?" He looked at Sol, who now turned to meet his gaze. "But you're not just something that escaped. You chose this. You stayed. You saved me." He reached out. Sol stepped closer and pressed his head gently into Jonas's chest. And the ice inside Jonas, ice that had been there for years, thick and hard as the lake, cracked. Then, finally, it broke. They didn't take the easy road north. From the ice-locked forests of Saskatchewan through mountain passes and frozen river valleys, Jonas Hale guided Sol across nearly 1,000 miles of untamed land. No maps, no roads, just instinct, survival, and a growing sense of purpose neither of them could ignore anymore. He wasn't just running, he was delivering Sol home. The Yukon Wildlife Sanctuary, hidden deep in the boreal woods outside Whitehorse, was built for creatures like Sol, rescued wolves, big cats, and bears once held illegally or bred for entertainment. But nothing had ever come through their gates quite like this. Sol was unlike any cougar they'd seen. Larger, smarter, eerily calm around humans. And he didn't just adapt, he observed, listened, responded to names, voice tones, gestures. He never paced in circles, never showed stress signs like animals pulled from cages. He walked the perimeter fence once, looked up at Jonas, and sat down, as if to say, "You choose. If you trust them, so will I." Jonas met the director himself, a woman named Adrienne, sharp-eyed, soft-spoken. When she looked at Sol, She didn't just see a cat. She saw a story. That's when Jonas handed her the small data chip, recovered from Sol's tracking implant. It had taken weeks to access. But once decrypted, it told everything: unauthorized biological testing, illegal containment, failed enhancement protocols, the so-called behavioral compliance program, coordinates, names, paper trails, everything. Adrian didn't waste time. She called in a journalist, then another, wildlife lawyers, ethical scientists. Within days, the story exploded. Private lab tested big cats for behavioral control. Exposed by retired hunter. Wildlife sanctuary becomes safe haven for escaped test subject. WHO owns a lion's mind. The public outcry was immediate. Within a month, the lab site had been shut down under emergency injunction. Nova Gene Industries, publicly a biotech startup, privately a secret contractor, had its assets frozen pending investigation. Former employees flipped. Whistleblowers came forward. Ethical watchdog groups rallied, using Sol's case as a symbol of what needed to change. Jonas wanted no interviews. He refused TV crews, declined book deals. He stayed in the Yukon, quietly building a new life among the trees. It was spring when they finished the new cabin, built with local hands. Logs notched and sealed tight, facing the wide-open snowfield where Sol now roamed freely in a protected stretch of land miles wide. Jonas sat on the porch most mornings with a tin mug of black coffee and silence for company. But this silence didn't weigh anymore. It hummed. Sol had grown stronger, leaner, fully mature now. His coat was thick, golden as late sunlight. When he walked, he did so with the ease of something that belonged to the wild again, but never quite left behind the man who pulled him from the ice. Each morning, Sol would pass the porch, just within sight, and glance back. Just once. It was all the conversation they needed. Adrian often said Sol's survival had started a conversation. About ownership. About sentience. About how far humans should go to control what they didn't fully understand. But for Jonas, the change ran deeper. One evening, as pink light spilled over the trees and snow, he sat carving a new wooden post, something to mark the edge of the porch. On it, he etched one word: Sol. Not just the name, but the meaning. Sun, warmth after cold, hope after the freeze. Jonas leaned back, watching as Sol padded across the snowy field. Tail flicking, paws silent. The big cat paused, nose lifted to the wind, then looked back at the porch. At him. Jonas smiled. He should have died on that lake, he said softly, voice nearly lost in the breeze. But the cold saved him from a cage. And he stopped, looked at the fire burning in the hearth behind him, then at the lion walking free in the snow. He saved me from the winter in my own heart. Sol blinked slowly, then turned toward the trees and disappeared into the quiet. Not gone, just free.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.